Okay, and with that, we can get started. I did hear from Steve Crawford. He was unable to join today due to being out in eastern Montana with limited reception. So we have a quorum. We have everybody here from the advisory council other than Steve. So with that, I will pass it right over to Kathy.
Sounds good. Yeah, let's grab that door. Okay, so first off, can everybody hear me okay online?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, great. And then if you feel so inclined, you folks online should be able to turn on your video if you want us to see your smiling faces. That was a problem last time, but this time it should be fixed. All right, great. So Andrew sent out a general agenda for today, and so we're just going to move right on into section 2 here, which was a discussion of specific goals for the council. And basically my thoughts on this were to come up as a group with some guiding principles so that we can kind of operate within those sideboards. And so when I talk about guiding principles, I have a couple that kind of came to mind. I'll give out one of them and kind of give you an idea of what I'm thinking. And so that first one that's on my mind is that, you know, as we are coming up with recommendations for this report, I think one of our guiding principles should be ensuring consumer protection and safety. So any of the recommendations that we put down in a report, I think should have that as a main consideration. And now that you kind of get an idea of some guidelines that I'm thinking of, you know, as we're discussing, if you come up with something else, please feel free to contribute to this discussion and any other principles that you might have. I have 3 in total. And so, you know, the first is the consumer, having their health and safety in mind. The second recommendation I have is to base all of our discussion and recommendations in science and data. We shouldn't be putting forth recommendations on personal beliefs or feelings. And then the third guiding principle that I think is meaningful is to develop clear recommendations and guidance that considers alignment with other states, federal or international standards when possible and appropriate. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel if we don't have to. And I know that marijuana and synthetics is new and evolving. However, I think we can, you know, look to existing standards that might be in place that are similar, or try and attempt to future-proof any regulations that or recommendations that we put forth by seeing, you know, what other states might be doing and, you know, trying to look towards the future. So with that, does anyone have any concerns with those guiding principles? Do you have any additional ones to think of? I know I'm just kind of springing this on you. But you know, any other recommendations or thoughts on
that? One, I don't know how to exactly word it, but I'd like to do our best to avoid any adverse effects on the regulated legal industry right now and the way they're processing. So, you know, we've been in conversations about this before, but, you know, we got to obviously address decarboxylation and things like that we as operators and licensees still have to do. So bearing in mind the existing industry.
Yeah, I think that's great. So avoiding adverse effects on the existing legal program. Any others out there? Another one that I've kind of tossed around is promoting education and research opportunities in the space. I don't think we'll put forth any recommendations that thwart that in any means, but I do think it's a worthwhile thought to put out there.
I really like that one, actually. I don't know if we want to discuss it more, but I do like emphasizing we don't know everything are open to on
All right, so I'm just going to read them off again. We have 5 in total. It's ensuring consumer protection and safety, base recommendations on data and science, develop clear recommendations and guidance that considers alignment with other states, federal and/or international standards if possible, avoid adverse effects on the existing program, and promote education and research opportunities. All right, and as we, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead, Eric.
My only concern, which I don't know if it's a real one or not, is some of these are pretty far outside what 948 has tasked us to do.
Yeah.
So I would imagine we still have to stay within the bounds of 948, or are we allowed to propose things that aren't related to the 2 things we've been tasked?
So
We add to it even though they didn't specifically ask for it, I guess is my question.
So sub 4 says the advisory council shall review available research, data, and regulations of other jurisdictions related to synthetic marijuana products, including but not limited to some definitions such as pairing and synthetic derivatives, synthetic derived cannabinoids, potential guidelines for safe manufacturing, and that's kind of where it ends. And it talks about the report. So
Right.
when it says including but not limited to, so I think if we come across something that isn't specifically here, we have the liberty to do that just with that language. Is what do other people think?
I think what you just said, Kathy, makes the scope, large enough to have these types of guiding principles in effect.
So for the rest of this meeting, I've kind of broken this up into a couple main points. So I'd like to discuss terms and definitions, which is specific to what was in House Bill 948, and then move to recommendations on potential guidelines for safe manufacturing, which was also specifically mentioned in House Bill 948. I expanded the discussion a little bit, as you'll see. I think there's more definitions than just synthetic cannabinoids and impairing that we could try and tackle here. And so let's just move straight on into the agenda and look at terms and definitions. And I have 2 things to just say out loud and get everyone's opinion on. The first is that there are some big differences between statutory definitions and administrative rule definitions. And so as we're going through this, I think it would be good to keep in the front of your mind, these definitions that we come up with, are they really appropriate for statute, or would they be better served in administrative rule, right? So statutory definitions are a little more broad, sort of more a 40,000 foot view on the issue. And they're harder to change, right? The legislature has the authority to do that. That's once every 2 years. It's a more in-depth process to change law. And so with administrative rules, those rules can kind of get a little more granular, and they're easier to change and can be changed on a quicker basis, right? And so given that the synthetics realm is so new, I would advise that any definition that tends to get a little more technical, a little more granular, should be pushed more towards the administrative rule bucket versus the statutory bucket. So something to keep in mind as we're discussing this, I think we have the potential to come up with some really great language, but then we'll also have to have a discussion of, well, where is this most appropriate? And then the other comment I have, and I'll stop talking and let other people jump in, is that there's no standard nomenclature in this world, right? And when we're talking about synthetics, some states call it cannabinoid hemp, others call it hemp-derived cannabinoids, synthetic cannabinoids. However, I will say that Montana is unique in that in statute, they have defined it to be synthetic marijuana product, which I find to be a little bit of a misnomer, because these actually aren't marijuana products. They're not sourced from marijuana. They're actually sourced from hemp. And so one of the things I would like to put out to the group is actually making a recommendation to slightly change that terminology from synthetic marijuana product to synthetic cannabinoid product. That way, we're not directing the reader to think that it's marijuana or that it's hemp, but just strictly calling it what it is. It's a cannabinoid product that is made synthetically. And so that is my 2 cents on these terms and definitions. So I'm going to kind of take a back seat here and let the group discuss, but let's start off with the term synthetic cannabinoids. It is a term that House Bill 948 specifically asks for. They actually ask for synthetically derived cannabinoids, but it is something that's specifically asked for in House Bill 948. And so if anyone has any suggestions or would like to open up discussion on what this definition could look like. And maybe actually I'll just start off by reading what is actually in law. Let me find it here quick. So House Bill 948 defines synthetic cannabinoid as synthetic cannabinoid has a meaning provided in the Montana Controlled Substances Act and includes any cannabinoids produced artificially, whether from chemical synthesis or biosynthesis using recombinant biological agents, including but not limited to yeast and algae.
So they are specifically talking about artificially produced, not extracted from him.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I read this, I think the term chemical synthesis is sort of the tripping point here. I think the biosynthesis using recombinant biological agents is pretty clear. That's yeast and algae that have been genetically modified to make these cannabinoids. And so the biological synthesis is clear in my eyes, but chemical synthesis could need some clarification.
Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say, just doing a survey of definitions, and I'm finding stuff from other states' rules. I've noticed that I think it was Oregon had they use the term artificially derived cannabinoid, I think, mostly. And And they also had a section that of things that it does not include. So for example, say a naturally occurring chemical substance that is separated from the plant cannabis family, Cannabidiaceae, by a chemical or mechanical extraction process. That is not, you know, an artificially derived cannabinoid in their terms. So that might be something we should consider.
I was gonna say that same thing, and to piggyback off that, in the naturally occurring chemical substance being, for example, delta-9 THCA or whatever, there are solvents that are used to extract that. So if we did what Oregon did and added the does not include sections, then we can clarify that. They also do have, I think it was a decarboxylation tied into that as well. So it's a good opportunity to clarify that if it isn't already.
Yeah, I agree. I think adding language that says, hey, this is what it is, and this is also what it is not. I think that's a good way to go. And that leads us kind of perfectly into decarboxylation. And some states do go on to define that, which is something we could consider in our recommendation. Again, just having to be very clear that, you know, decarboxylation is the process of turning perhaps like a naturally derived acidic cannabinoid into its neutral form. What I fear with decarboxylation is that we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't allow decarboxylation of synthetics. So just because you decarboxylate a synthetic doesn't not make it a synthetic anymore. I have seen some states that go on to list out specific cannabinoids that they allow. So that's something that we could consider.
I mean, I don't know if we want to limit ourselves to what is not allowed, because they're constantly inventing new synthetics. So I think we need to figure out a way to exclude these constantly changing cannabinoids that are being created. And maybe, and I know because they're like delta-8 can be, I mean, all of them can be technically manufactured synthetically too. So yeah, I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really valid point. And the other thing that's going to complicate this is that a lot of these synthetics that we've been talking about do have a natural analog. You know, they can potentially be found in the biomass. And so we have to be very careful about how we word these to make sure that to make sure that we're addressing synthetics adequately without, you know, adversely affecting the natural derived space as well.
Just curious, where does CBD fall into this? Because I guess, or like CBN, for example, CBN manufactured from CBD, it's non-intoxicating. CBN's naturally occurring. It's the degraded product you'll get if you had a biomass sitting around for a couple years. You came back and tested it, you'll have high concentrations of CBN. I mean, you'd mentioned highlighting compounds that we might consider recommending to be allowed. Do CBD and CBN, I guess broadly kind of considered non-psychoactive, fall into that? Or is it just a blanket if it was synthetically manufactured that we throw out?
Yes, so the language of House Bill 948 doesn't care about the intoxicating or non-intoxicating effects of these cannabinoids. It only focuses on the synthetic process. And so CBN is one of those really hard ones because, it's generally considered non-intoxicating. However, CBN in the majority of cases that a person may buy online or wherever is made synthetically. It is made from a convergent CBD. And yes, there also is this more natural process, I guess you could say, where with time and heat or light or pressure, you can also make it. But the high purity stuff that you can buy is made through a synthetic process, unfortunately. So, and I know that's been a hard one for the industry to digest.
I think it's also been a point of contention because my understanding of its synthesis is a non-chemical synthesis using heat and light. So I think that's been another source of pushback, which I'm empathetic to. So maybe that's where we draw the line, is that the chemical synthesis, again, Oregon defined their artificially derived cannabinoids as, I think they got into chemicals synthesis, or maybe not, but our chemical, they said it does not include or that's for the naturally occurring piece. I've got it up here, but I don't know, something to consider.
The other thing I'd like to throw out is that some states also choose to define the term semi-synthetic cannabinoid. So that's something we can discuss as well. So you have these synthetic cannabinoids, right, which is a term that captures everything. But then when you go down a layer deeper, you get to semi-synthetic cannabinoids, and those would be cannabinoids that are converted through a chemical process from one cannabinoid to another. So your starting material is a cannabinoid. You're making another cannabinoid, whereas the term synthetic captures semi-synthetic and also includes this synthetic creation of cannabinoids from starting points that are not already cannabinoids. Does anyone see any pros or cons to dividing those terms out into synthetic cannabinoid and semi-synthetic cannabinoid?
I think we should combine them, keep them all under the synthetic label, if possible. And since they both require some human element of, yeah.
And the difference being semi-synthetic is starting as a cannabinoid versus like biosynthesis or something.
So almost. So semi-synthetic, correct. You would be starting from CBD, and you can convert that into any other cannabinoid via a chemical synthesis. Synthesis would also capture sort of like this true chemical synthesis where you're making, let's say, delta-8 THC from materials that are not cannabinoids. You're starting from like olivitol or something. Yep. So you're going, that chemical synthesis is different than just the semi-synthesis. Gotcha. But they're both synthetic processes.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't see a need to differentiate personally.
I would concur. I mean, just from a provider perspective, like treatment providers are already going to ask enough questions. So I think it would limit the amount of confusion just for the layperson and general public. If there's synthetic is synthetic, whether it's derived from cannabinoids or some other substance. As long as there's a synthetic process to it, then it makes sense to me.
I was looking again at I created a list of all the definitions that are out there amongst whatever, all these agencies, but it seems like everyone is struggling to cover. I mean, none of those definitions in my mind are like, oh yes, they nailed it. And so it's definitely gonna be a struggle to figure out or to kind of, because I mean, we're not the first one to tackle this. I think this has been an ongoing problem for the last 20 years. As Europe has been kind of dealing with this for the last 2 decades. But they've not nailed it down yet either.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue, and it's very technical. And
Yeah.
as soon as you start talking about isomers and
Mhm.
chemical synthesis, you can kind of paint yourself into an inadvertent corner. with your
Yeah.
definition.
That's where I was trying to remember. So the initial intent of the marijuana law was to let people use the marijuana plant, perhaps whatever, grind it up, add it to some of their brownies or whatever. But I don't think the whole intent was to create this whole pharmaceutical industry that creates these individual compounds. Anyways, I'm just kind of trying to take a step back. So yeah.
These are actually stemmed from that federal hemp law. The marijuana law, those licensees in Montana, I don't know of any that are intentionally doing any of this because, like you said, it was intended to provide access to the consumer. It's mostly those that are trying to circumvent laws like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds like most of us, at least who've spoken, are leaning more towards not defining semi-synthetic and just keeping it at synthetic cannabinoid, and capturing everything with one definition.
Correct.
And then, so I have some notes to myself here. Does anyone have any heartburn or strong opinions on whether or not we use the term synthetic cannabinoids or synthetically derived cannabinoids? Does one seem to work better?
I think synthetic cannabinoids is, I mean, that seems to be the most frequently used term in the literature too. Kind of leave the derived part out. Because that could limit us too much, maybe.
Yeah, something to keep kind of thinking about. Nothing's, in stone yet. Obviously, we're kind of hashing out the details, but so let's move on a little bit here. So I also wanted to throw out to the group the term synthetic cannabinoid product. This would be a replacement in statute for what House Bill 948 calls synthetic marijuana product. So this again would be kind of trying to better align with the national landscape. We are the only state that calls it a synthetic marijuana product. It's a little bit of a misnomer because it's not marijuana. It has and could have the intoxicating effects of marijuana, but it's not sourced from it. So I'm inclined to try and correct that nomenclature, and I think that will kind of future-proof our language as well.
That would make my job easier for sure.
Yeah, I agree. I think we should change it to cannabinoid versus marijuana because of that line.
Okay. So I think we're within our bounds to suggest that as a recommendation for House Bill 948. It's still the same exact product. We're still talking about the same exact thing. We're just kind of correcting the course of the nomenclature. Okay, so I'll let that kind of sit with folks. The other couple of definitions or terms I'm gonna throw at you are kind of the opposite side of this coin, which is, what are your thoughts on potentially defining the term natural cannabinoids or natural cannabinoid product? This could potentially give us an opportunity to say, well, this includes, everything in the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, MARTA. It could give us an opportunity to give both sides of the coin, maybe, hopefully clarify things. Are there any thoughts on that?
I suppose defining it is one thing, but how it later gets used is where the point of concern would be,
So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, Delta 8 is a naturally occurring, a lot of these are naturally occurring. So I guess it just, if that's how we kind of used it to define naturally occurring, then it's a good thing. I think we should define it, but I could still, like Yona was saying, I could see us leaving room for error if we get too granular with it.
Yep, understood. And so to me, this all kind of boils down to really identifying the process of a chemical synthesis, right? So I think we all kind of have this guttural reaction to what is natural and what is synthetic. But defining that conclusively, I think is directing us back to defining chemical synthesis.
Ask a quick question on that. Just because I don't understand it, and you probably know what they were trying to get at. One of the definitions they asked us to provide was also artificial, as opposed, is there a distinction between artificial versus synthetic that I'm not
I don't
getting?
think so, no. I mean, when I read this, I think those are just synonyms of each other, right? They're the same thing. In my eyes, maybe others have different opinions, and please, speak up if you do, but I would almost use the word artificial to define synthetic cannabinoids. That's my take.
Yeah, one other thought, wonder if we want to throw in the word psychoactive substances in our definition too. I was just thinking the core at the core of the problem is, I mean, not like CBD or the other ones, if they're not psychoactive, they're not going to cause a problem. People are not going to buy them or they're going to be used illegally. So maybe that helps us narrow down some of our problems.
Yeah, and I understand, that angle for sure. And some states have tried to, define intoxicating, potentially intoxicating and non-intoxicating, and it gets messy because, a lot of these cannabinoids are so novel, there's absolutely no research on it. And, and then you're tasked with defining intoxicating, and that shoves you into this pharmacology realm where you're talking about CD1 and CD2 receptors, and it gets really complex. And for the purpose of House Bill 948, there's no mention of whether or not these are intoxicating or non-intoxicating. It's just strictly whether they're synthetic.
Okay.
Any other thoughts out there? There's really no wrong answer. This is, everybody's trying to just do their best. All the states are doing it slightly different, just like everything else in this industry. So the discussion's been great. So feel free. There's no wrong answer. I'll throw one last definition idea out, or term at least, is cannabinoid product. So we've discussed synthetic cannabinoid products, natural cannabinoid products, and then kind of what about this overarching cannabinoid product? Would there be a useful purpose for something like that?
That seems like it's going to muddy the waters, in my opinion.
Okay, I'm just going to go down the list I only have a few more to talk about. We already touched on decarboxylation. I do have a few notes here that I'll share. A lot of it's already been touched on. Personal note to myself was just to be as clear as possible as to what is allowed or prohibited here. We discussed whether or not to list out specific cannabinoids or not to. And then I touched on this earlier, but I do think it's really important here not just to say decarboxylation is allowed, because then we will have people that will synthetically produce an acidic version of an intoxicating cannabinoid, decarboxylate it, and say that it's allowed because decarboxylation is allowed. So we have to be really clear when we kind of dive into this, and making sure that just because you decarboxylate a synthetic cannabinoid doesn't somehow make it non-synthetic.
Oh, correct. But at the same time, decarbonization is kind of it's a natural occurring process too.
Yep.
And I was reading through all these definitions of synthetics, and I think I still like the one I found. I'm just gonna throw it out there too. On the AFDO, which is the Association of Food and Drug Officials, on their website, there was this presentation where they define synthetic cannabinoids as chemical compounds created through a chemical process by human agency as opposed to those of natural origin. And that kind of, then we don't, because natural origin would include the decarboxylation process to some extent, but if you're going to push it, it could fall under human agency, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I think that specific definition you just read, I think, is a really great stab at a statutory definition of chemical process or chemical synthesis. But then you, right on the nose, brought up an argument as to decarboxylation? Is that is that by human agency? And with THCA and the marijuana program, I think the argument would be like, yeah, that's definitely by human agency, right? That's going through a process, but we can't. We need to allow that to be a process.
Yeah, well,
Otherwise,
that's, well, you could, decarbonization usually happens just by letting it dry, letting your product dry. So it's not, I wouldn't, that, I mean, maybe we can find some way, because that's not necessarily considered, drying is not necessarily considered a chemical process.
It's heat
Right.
usually that we're using to decarboxylate. And so, yeah, if you further defined it with the chemical process, then, but then again, it still leaves room for error, like Kathy's saying, because then someone might interpret a synthetic cannabinoid can now be decarboxylated and then be allowed.
yeah, and just to clarify things, like there is a decarboxylation process that can happen on flower, but generally when people are talking about decarboxylation, it's on concentrates and extracts where they're changing the acidic form to the neutral form to put into infused products.
Just a thought, is it worth a definition for, cannabinoids in the legal market as, they are derived from cannabis sativa or, cannabis inflorescences, that type of thing, plant derived? That's more generic, and this could create pitfalls, but just a thought.
Or
Because then if you're making THCA synthetically, you can't, if that's not, cannabis sativa derived or indica, whatever you want to, botanically define it as, it's synthetic, so it doesn't meet the criteria.
Oregon does this in their artificially derived cannabinoid definition, where they do the does not include. It does not include cannabinoids that are produced by decarboxylation from a naturally occurring cannabinoid acid without the use of a chemical catalyst. So if we did add a does not include, you could blanket in the legal industry, rope that in there.
I kind of like that last, addition you mentioned.
Yeah, I kind of do too. And the addition of a chemical catalyst narrows it down as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be like an acid catalyst or a metal catalyst. Whereas, decarboxylation doesn't use that. Great discussion. I still feel myself getting drawn to having to define chemical synthesis, though.
I think so too. I think that needs to be a clear-cut boundary. I do like the human agency language that Yona had read from, I can't remember what organization, but
Abdo, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes when I'm thinking about synthetics, I try to think about synthetics that you find outside of marijuana. So think about like maybe a synthetic diamond or synthetic fibers and what make those synthetic. If that helps anyone in as you're kind of digesting this. And the human agency becomes a big piece of that, right? Because the only way you make a synthetic fiber or a synthetic diamond is with human hands, right? That was the only reason that came to be.
perhaps if we define the chemical synthesis or the synthesis definition, that's where we could do that does not include, and kind of blanket in those other options as well. And then just keep the synthetic cannabinoid language definition clean.
Mhm.
Are there any other terms out there that you feel might be necessary to clarify things? I know I've thrown a lot out at you all, but perhaps I'm missing something, not seeing an angle somewhere. Okay, so there's one more, well, it's two more definitions I have really. One is impairing, and that was specifically called out in House Bill 948. This I don't have a lot of background in. I was hoping to kind of rely on our law enforcement guys for this to sort of come up with a potential definition here. Does anyone have any thoughts on impairing?
It's not good because I don't know how to do it. And I don't, my opinion is I don't think the state in general knows how to do it either, because I'm basing that on the fact that the state doesn't have an impairing definition for prescription drugs.
Oh,
Because I think we only have it for THC and alcohol. You can still get a DUI for prescription drugs, but by statute, they've intentionally left it out. So it's just done on a case by case with a jury and a prosecutor. And I've always been told it's because it's too difficult for the state to do it reliably. So I'm guessing from that standpoint, we might have the same problem. Because if we said something wasn't impairing, then or we don't have evidence of it being impairing, then someone could use that in a DUI defense and say, well, this program says it's not, so how can I get a DUI?
right,
And
exactly.
I know that would send the state into a tizzy.
Yeah.
And vice versa. If we said it was impairing, then that could also affect the whole driving aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it could get messy really quick.
Right. It might, my just general opinion is that I think if we delve too far into it, we're going to be stepping on law enforcement as it relates to driving.
Yeah. Yeah, and then on like the testing side of it, yeah, you can test for metabolites in blood, but there's no standardized level that says you were impaired because of this substance. And so, you know, I don't think from an enforcement standpoint, it's a very wise move to maybe even try to define this. I'm not sure. I don't know. I know Steve's not on, but maybe Shane has an opinion.
Again, it's very hard to, it's very gray area. And a lot of times they have levels, of course, when you deal with alcohol, where you're presumed to be impaired at a certain level of alcohol. I don't know how we do this. And even the definition, the textbook definition of impairment appears to be pretty vague. So I really don't know, I mean, how we go about doing this without affecting everything down the line. Sorry, that's even more vague than the definition.
That's totally fine. I think that really just kind of leads us down this road that maybe this isn't the time or the bill to try and attempt this.
The best I've been able to even come up with is since they specifically told us to define impairing, I think the best we could do to not trample everything else in the state, is just say that we can't tell you what's impairing, but we can tell you what the literature says is psychoactive. And then just have to leave it at that.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure I'm guessing the lawmakers want to know what's psychoactive versus not. But, and we can probably give them that from literature. We just can't give them concentrations or anything, but we can at least say, this is psychoactive, this isn't, but we can't tell you whether it's impairing or not.
Exactly. And then like to further complicate
It's
it,
kind of funny, but
I think that's okay. You know, it's okay not to know the answers. To further complicate this, I think pairing will be even more difficult to kind of pin down when we start talking about all of these different synthetics, right? So it's hard just in the context of regular old original Delta-9 THC, but then when we start talking about Delta-8 and Delta-10 and all these long risks of other ones, what's impairing means for those. And so I think that's a just fine answer. You know, we can't do any better than, you know, than what the literature says. Is there any group consensus on impairing? Do you think this is something we should tackle further, or leave for maybe when there's more substantive literature?
I agree. I think impairing is too subjective and qualitative. I think psychoactive or not, according to the literature, would be our best route to take, if any.
mm-hmm.
Okay, so one last definition. This one came from John Spear. So John, feel free to interject, but you provided a definition of manufacturing. Do you want to talk about that one a little bit?
Yeah, I just you know, House Bill 948 has, you know, the word manufacture in there, but I couldn't find it defined anywhere. That doesn't mean it's not defined in statute somewhere in the mass of statute. But yeah, I just was doing a quick kind of jump at this and for our last meeting, and found one that I thought is at least worth discussing, if it's something we want to recommend. Want me to read it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I found a term. This was from, you know, a legal site online. And it is the term manufacture means the production, preparation, propagation, compounding, or processing of a substance, either directly or indirectly, or by extraction from substances of natural origin, or independently by means of chemical synthesis, or by a combination of extraction and chemical synthesis, and includes any packaging or repackaging of such substance, or labeling or relabeling of its container, except that such term does not include the preparation, compounding, packaging, or labeling of substance in conformity with applicable state or local law by a practitioner as an incident to their administration or dispensing of such substance in the course of their professional practice. And this came out of like, you know, drug rulings, I think at the, you know, federal government level of, you know, some case somewhere out in the world. Kind of a mouthful, but it seems to cover, has the caveat of, you know, people who do things legally with the same materials, if we're not going to distinguish things.
Yeah, and it includes, you know, both natural origin and chemical synthesis within the definition.
Yeah.
I'm curious if maybe the reference you pulled this from has a definition of chemical synthesis.
Probably.
Could you maybe try and see if they do?
Yeah, I will do that. Yeah. Yeah, and one little side thing is I think I shared a link with the group, which hopefully will appear for everybody at some point soon. There is I mentioned it last meeting, there's a company, it's 180 Life Sciences. They have quite the repertoire of like members, people who have developed and brought all sorts of FDA approved drugs to the market. But they're looking at synthetic cannabinoid analogs. And so, the one little side, it's not a major deal, but it would, let's say this company was able to get FDA approval for something, it was a synthetic cannabinoid analog. Would it be legal in the state per this definition, per House Bill 948? That's a good one for Tony.
If it's FDA approved, it's the only way that it would be legal in the state from a pharmaceutical perspective.
Tony, you're breaking up quite a bit. Can you repeat that?
Thanks. Let me try that. I don't know if my connection is very good. Can you hear me?
That's significantly better. Thanks.
No? Okay. So if I understood the question right, Jonathan, if it's been FDA approved, it is legal. That's really the only way any of these would enter our marketplace.
It's legal, but then it would be also managed or administered through the FDA route. And technically we should not, we cannot have two regulatory agencies then tackling the same compound, I guess.
Yeah, like
That's the way I see it.
yeah, I
This
guess
is an excellent, sorry, just to interject, this is an excellent segue to the next topic. That's getting off of definitions and terms. And so, this kind of falls into the potential guidelines for safe manufacturing, which is going to be a big discussion and very much involves FDA. And just a couple notes I'm going to throw out and then open it up for discussion. The FDA technically prohibits CBD in food and in dietary supplements. They also are not sufficiently addressing hemp cannabinoids or hemp ingredients in consumer products. If you've read any of the articles out there about their participation in this space, they're really kind of digging their heels in and not really participating. And there are a few reasons for that they provide. And so when it comes to this language in House Bill 948 asking us, the state, to give potential recommendations on safe manufacturing, I think this is actually a really, really difficult conversation because the federal government, the FDA, isn't really interested in participating in it for their laundry list of reasons. I think this is further complicated by the fact that the 2018 Farm Bill is coming up for review, and whatever edits or amendments or changes that might happen to the definition of hemp or anything tangential to that could have huge implications on any recommendation we might give. And so last piece, which I know is there's a lot to digest here, but there is this thing, and I think hopefully Tony can straighten me out on this, called the dangerous drug analog that is found in the Montana Controlled Substances Act. And I have a suspicion that this language might actually prohibit us from even giving a safe method guidelines in our report, because this dangerous drug analog basically says any analog that has similar intoxicating effects to something that's on the schedule is considered scheduled. So that was a lot to unpack. So I'm going to let you guys sort of sort through that.
A real quick question. I caught part of it. What you said the FDA prohibits CBD in what was it again?
They actually prohibit CBD in food and dietary supplements.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but obviously, you see those products everywhere. Yeah, they just don't. They do little to no enforcement. They've only occasionally will send out warning letters to certain manufacturers, and it's usually in regards to exorbitant health claims that they have on their labels.
Montana is okay with the current CBD being available, or no?
No, our health department follows federal code, and so our health department says the same thing. That CBD shouldn't be allowed in food. But again, you still see it everywhere. The enforcement is, is lacking for different reasons. But that's kind of the realm we're living in with CBD specifically. But maybe, Tony, are you familiar with the definition of drug, dangerous drug analog in the Controlled Substances Act for Montana?
I am. Can you guys hear me, or am I breaking up still?
It's much better, thank you.
Okay. Part of what happened is with that analog really is from the I guess law enforcement side is that really what we were seeing and what we're seeing in this parallels each other, where when we were seeing the spice drugs at the gas stations that were crazy. I remember the Florida man and all that other stuff. But really, law enforcement came to us because we have to agree every legislative session of what is and what is not a controlled substance. So every 2 years, we go back in and we say this changed in the scheduling and we need to agree. But what law enforcement wanted to do was basically build a backbone structure, and anything derivative of that backbone structure then would fall under a scheduled drug. So they were changing the structures of those spice drugs so fast. Bath salts is another word. They were changing those so fast that law enforcement wasn't sure they could enforce any of the regulations because they didn't fall under that. So we changed the wording to add in the analog so that we have the backbone structure and then can just base our scheduling off of the backbone.
So when we are talking about Delta 8, Delta 10, all the different cannabinoids, that we've had this couple meetings with the discussion on, do they fall under the definition of a dangerous drug analog?
I'm not a lawyer. I can ask our legal department, but in my opinion, yes.
And I have the definition here if it might be helpful to listen to it. It actually doesn't even have to be that closely related, as long as the effect it produces is similar to the parent molecule. It seems like it could be scheduled. So I'll just read it out loud. It says dangerous drug analog means any material, compound, mixture, or preparation that is structurally related to or chemically derived from any dangerous drug in Schedules 1 through 5 set forth in the Controlled Substances Act, or that is expressly or impliedly represented to produce or does produce a physiological effect similar to or greater than the effect of a dangerous drug in Schedules 1 through 5. And there's also a subpart B here that goes on to say if it's an FDA drug, then it's, you know, not considered, or it doesn't fall into a dangerous drug analog. But I think this is something that we need to dive into further, because if the Montana Controlled Substances Act and this definition of dangerous drug analog captures all of these synthetics that we're talking about, then I don't think are we lawfully even allowed to put forth any marijuana, or excuse me, any manufacturing guidelines.
Would it be helpful if I asked the Board of Pharmacy's legal counsel to join the next meeting?
I think that would,
Yes.
I think, be helpful for me. Or, you know, if you wanted to speak to them and bring back their answers, however we can get some of these questions answered, I think would be helpful.
Will do.
And I have a few other pieces of the Controlled Substances Act that I think might be worth saying out loud as well. And maybe, Tony, you have some things to say on this too. But the Controlled Substances Act of Montana in 50-32-222 sub 4 sub KK specifically lists synthetic cannabinoids. And then it goes on to list, you know, all the different, it gets really technical, and it goes on to list, you know, all these, you know, technical chemical names, and gets kind of difficult to understand. And it would be interesting to have their take on that as well, because, you know, if the Controlled Substances Act says that these are illegal, then they're illegal, and that we shouldn't be putting forth guidelines on how to manufacture them.
I like that.
But I'm also not, I mean, I am not an expert in this document, and it would be nice to get some guidance from your team, if at all possible.
I'll set it up.
That's great, thank you. So as far as the potential guidelines for safe manufacturing, we'll just put a temporary hold on this until we get some questions answered from that. I guess in a hypothetically, let's say, you know, Tony's folks come back and say, nope, these aren't technically scheduled. To play devil's advocate here, you know, knowing that the FDA doesn't want to participate in this conversation, or just won't for whatever reason at this point, you know, that puts the regulatory framework on the state. And I guess, is there any opinions or discussion to be had out there about whether or not the state is equipped to have meaningful regulatory authority and enforcement over synthetics?
Well, I'd say no, but I think other states have gotten around that by saying, well, you know, you need to just, you know, meet the criteria for generally recognized as safe, you know, by FDA standards, blah, blah, blah. They have that etched in their code, or at least their recommendation. I think Colorado did that.
Yeah, Yeah, that's a good point, John. I think actually a few more states may have gone that route too, which is basically, sure, you can do it if the feds say it's okay, and then when they don't, then it just doesn't happen. But it also says, you know, should the FDA put forth some authority or some framework to do this, then they could do it.
It does seem like Colorado has, you know, some state structure to kind of make some level of judgment, but it didn't seem to go too deep. They were like, you know, they had like a hemp products, you know, approval process. And what exactly that entails, I'd have to look into it more. But I always was running into, yeah, you know, FDA approval essentially.
Yeah, I just worry that this is too big of a an ask for
Yeah.
any of our state agencies. And so even though, you know, like Eric mentioned, there are ways to make these compounds in high purity amounts, but if there's no regulatory framework or enforcement mechanisms to keep people and actually do that, I'm not sure this is really a viable option for the state of Montana.
It does have, you already are currently doing this for the marijuana industry. I mean,
That is,
there's a lot of extraction, there's a lot of concentration, there's a lot of things that are going on that the state does feel like we can regulate at a safe level as long as everybody's in the program.
great.
So why would we not be able to do it if it came safe for hemp? And it was the same process. If they were able to extract it, concentrate it, decarboxylate it or not, wouldn't that not be the same regulatory expertise that you guys are already doing for marijuana? It just is a different starting material.
If it's strictly, I think if we're just strictly speaking extraction and concentration, that's one thing, but then the chemical
I
synthesis
agree.
is completely different.
It is different, but I'm
Yeah.
saying that I don't know that we can blanket it out as it's a dangerous drug when we already are doing it under a legal framework currently,
Yeah, and
just
then,
from a different source.
and then, you know, so hemp is under ag too, you know, and then marijuana is under revenue, but it's the same plant. And so it gets complex from a regulatory standpoint as well.
Sure, I get that, but I think that's what they're asking for, is because they want recommendations for potential guidelines to do just that.
And maybe perhaps the potential guidelines would be, you know, the FDA.
Well, but I'm worried about that because we don't require that level for the marijuana industry, so it would be weird to require that extreme level for this industry if there is a second.
No, Eric's got a good point. It's definitely, there's some, you know, there's perhaps a double standard there, but when you're, you know, when you're dealing with synthetics, I mean, I wouldn't say anything in the marijuana industry is like synthetic. It just isn't. It's extracted from plant. It's, you know, it's different than a synthesized product. And that's where I say no, because, you know, what are we're going to decide on standards and, you know, in the test regimen for synthetic products.
No,
we could do that. We can make recommendations. I would have no problem doing that, but I just don't think it's, you know, so straightforward necessarily, given the regulatory structure available.
yeah, it's certainly not straightforward, but
Yeah.
part of this does not include the synthesis from like raw stock materials. I mean, you wouldn't be extracting hemp and also making it from scratch. I guess that's my point. It seems like there's a distinction between, they're asking for part of it as what we're considering full synthetics, but they're also asking for extraction from existing products like hemp. So it seems like we might be able to say, yeah, there are safe ways to extract and concentrate from.
Yeah.
But not necessarily go out and buy a bunch of chemicals from Sigma and make them in a laboratory.
So the potential recommendation could be, sure, you can extract natural cannabinoids safely, as proven through every state's marijuana program, but then when it comes to specifically synthesizing cannabinoids, that's a different distinction.
It's a big distinction, and
Yes.
we might be able to do nothing, or we might be able to say this one single thing might be acceptable based on whatever, but we certainly would never be able to say that we could regulate the making of any synthetic cannabinoid from any process. But I don't think that's what they're asking for. They're just asking for potential guidelines on any safe methods. They're not saying we have to come up with one for everything, no matter what. And my example was the simple hemp extraction concentration. I mean, that to me, chemically, that seems identical to what's going on now.
Yeah.
And it just seems like that should be safe.
Yeah, the concentration or extraction and concentration process is well documented through all sorts of natural products, of which hemp and marijuana, technically the same plant, are natural products. And so, yeah, for the first part of this, recommendations of potential guidelines for safe methods of manufacturing, extracting, that I think is tried and true, right? You can manufacture and extract natural cannabinoids, but then and synthesizing cannabinoids, that's the hitch here.
It's almost a different topic.
Yes. And depending on what sort of discussion arises from Tony's folks, it might not even be a possibility if they're scheduled.
My concern with that would be if that discussion decides that Delta 8 and everything else is a dangerous drug analog, then what's that going to do to the legal marijuana industry? Is that not going to open them to attack for providing Delta 8, which is a natural part of marijuana? I would have a concern that we say this is a dangerous drug unless you're in our marijuana program, in which case it's perfectly fine. That would be I think it might open up the marijuana industry to criticism. Yeah, like it's either dangerous or it's not.
I think the legal protection for the existing industry would be in that we're already operating with a federally illegal drug. And so the state's already made its own program to say, yes, this is federally illegal, but we'll allow it. Whereas the Delta 8 and the others are technically the opposite, federally legal, and the state has come in to have its own legislation to regulate or ban it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems to me like where that the buck would stop at the existing marijuana program, because we're already saying, hey, we know it's not legal federally, but we're going to legalize.
But Delta 8 is in our current product now. Right?
True. And if we did say
that's my concern is that if we say Delta 8 is terrible and dangerous, then a lot of people would look to our current program and say, why are we allowing that in there?
I think that's a perfect circle back to the beginning of our meeting where, defining synthetic chemistry and synthetic cannabinoids, and maybe we would do want to define natural cannabinoids, because D8 and D10 fall both into synthetic cannabinoids, depending on how it's made, or natural, depending on how it was extracted and concentrated.
It's already said all of those are acceptable. But by having the program, they're saying that those non-Delta 9s are still safe and okay.
The program was built around Delta 9.
Right.
It wasn't built around these other ones. It just kind of happened, and we're like, oh, there are these other things, right?
I was agreeing. That's why I think having that natural definition is good, because otherwise people may not realize all of those other analogs are actually in the product.
Right. Yeah.
So if we define it as that tells us where it's coming from, so that we can make a distinction of that versus a laboratory.
Yes. Great discussion, everyone. We have 7 minutes left. And I thought it might be a good idea to kind of wrap up and discuss some tasks for next meeting. So we have already got one on the docket with Tony and some questions about the Controlled Substances Act. Please continue to mull over these definitions. Would it be beneficial if maybe we individually drafted a few and just went over them as a group, or how do you think would be best to sort of get some words on paper?
Probably get some words on paper that we can all review.
Yeah, okay, I think that sounds good to me
Yeah.
too, and then we can kind of start to piece stuff together and discuss
Yeah.
and
Comments.
formulate some definitions. I can maybe what I can do is, after today's discussion, I can send out a list of terms so that you're not accidentally defining something that by group consensus we kind of decided not to. Or if you feel strongly about including a term we didn't discuss, that's fine too. And then we'll sit down at our next meeting and discuss those. So we are starting to put up resources that we've been using as a group online on the website. So be checking in on that occasionally to see if there's anything new. We will be adding a couple extra resources. These are a few webinars that I have found extremely helpful about synthetics and why caring about isomerization is important. And this particular webinar draws parallels to the drug thalidomide and why it's important to care about isomerization. And then there's there's going to be 2 other webinars that I think are just excellent resources. I almost was going to view one for one of our meetings, but kind of decided against that. I felt like a substitute teacher move there. I would also invite folks to look at other states' task force reports as well. There's lots of really great information in there, and there may be angles that we haven't considered or thought about that would be in those reports. And then, does anyone out there have any familiarity with the FDA's adverse events reporting system? I think it's called FAERS. Or have used it and exported data off of it?
I have, it's more vaccinations or misfills, but not in this realm.
Okay.
So if somebody has an adverse event to a vaccine.
Gotcha. I recently watched a webinar where the presenter pulled a bunch of data off of that forum, and it was actually pretty alarming to see the adverse events reporting that has skyrocketed since 2018 in regards to synthetic cannabinoids, and was surprised to find that there's actually been 53 fatalities with these products. And so I am not familiar with the software or how to use it, and if anyone is proficient at it or wants to take a stab at it, it would be really interesting to see some more updated data on that. Some of the data I saw was 6 months old, and so if anyone wants to take a stab at that and has time, that would be great. I can forward. I'll with the email with the definitions, I will include the link to that if anyone wants to take a stab at it. With 3 minutes left, are there any questions, concerns, clarifications?
Zach's.
Oh my God, Zach, I'm so sorry.
You are golden. With 2 minutes left, we can push it to next week. It was kind of online with Eric's thoughts on naturally occurring Delta 8 in extractions and things like that. And not pertinent. We can jump on it next week or month.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, Andrew even gave me a heads up and then I completely
All good. All good.
got into it too much. Great, well, we'll add that to discuss first next time. And yeah, if you have any questions or concerns, reach out and please continue funneling us all of your information and resources. We'll get that up on the website. And great discussion, everyone. That was an excellent discussion.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you next month.